Dick Durbin has officially reached that stage of politics where the argument is not just weak, it's upside down. We're talking full pretzel logic. The debate over the Save America Act should be one of the easiest conversations in the world to follow. Should people prove they're American citizens before voting in American elections? That is not some wild, radical outer space idea. That is baseline common sense. And yet somehow, some of the loudest voices in Washington are treating it like the apocalypse. Before we get into how ridiculous that is, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below, because this is exactly the kind of issue where the spin gets so thick you almost need a shovel to get through it. And that's really the heart of the whole mess. This is not a debate where regular people are confused. Regular people hear proof of citizenship and think, yeah, obviously. That's the normal reaction. The average person is not sitting at home clutching the couch cushion in fear because someone suggested securing elections with basic documentation. They're wondering why this wasn't already handled cleanly and clearly a long time ago. That's why this argument from Democrats keeps falling flat outside of the usual activist bubble and cable news echo chamber. It just doesn't match real life. Durbin's pitch basically comes down to this: if you require proof of citizenship and photo ID, then millions of Americans will somehow be disenfranchised. Millions. That's the word they always jump to, isn't it? Not some. Not a few edge cases that should be addressed. Not administrative hiccups that need fixing. No, it's always millions. Everything is immediately framed like the Republic is one paperwork form away from collapse. And once you slow down and actually look at what he's saying, the whole thing starts wobbling.
I just had a question for the ranking member. I've heard other people say this, but I heard him say it this morning that the Save America Act will disenfranchise millions of Americans. The legislation requires proof of American citizenship and a photo ID to vote. So I don't understand how it could disenfranchise millions of Americans, and maybe he would explain.
I'm happy to. Thank you for that question, because I think all of us should be aware of the fact you have to present identification, correct? But your driver's license, which most people use in the course of business of every single day, is not acceptable. What is acceptable is a passport. 50% of Americans do not have a passport. Those who want to obtain it so they can vote will pay $186 and wait 3 or 4 weeks for that to happen. Secondly, you can use a birth certificate, but any person who has changed their name as a result of a marriage or a hyphenated relationship has to find not only their birth certificate, but some correction of it to prove that they're eligible to register to vote. It's estimated that 9% of the voters in America do not have the identification required by this bill. It means ultimately that those people will not be voting. And I think that is the ultimate goal of this administration.
Because think about it, we ask for identification for all kinds of things that are way less important than choosing the people who run the country. You need ID to buy alcohol. You need ID to board a plane. You need ID for certain jobs, certain buildings, certain financial transactions. In plenty of places, you need ID for things so ordinary they barely register as controversial. But voting, the thing that determines laws, courts, taxes, borders, schools, and basically the direction of the country. That's where some politicians suddenly act like asking for documentation is a human rights crisis. Come on. That's where this whole argument starts sounding less like concern and more like strategy. Because if you really believed in election confidence, if you really wanted the public to trust the process, then making citizenship verification clear, simple, and universal would be an easy win. It would remove doubt. It would shut down arguments. It would make the system stronger. And if your response to that is panic instead of support, people are going to ask the obvious question: why? Durbin tried to make the case that a driver's license isn't enough, that passports are expensive, that birth certificates can be difficult to track down, especially for people who change their names after marriage. And look, on the surface, that sounds emotionally effective. It's designed to make the law sound cold and bureaucratic. But here's the problem. The second you hear the actual rebuttal, the whole scare campaign starts falling apart. Mike Lee pointed out that the bill includes alternative mechanisms for people who can't locate their documents. In other words, the very problem problem Durbin was dramatizing had already been accounted for. And that's the part that really gives away the game, because once accommodations are built into the bill, once there's a process for people who don't have the standard paperwork on hand, then what exactly is the objection if the law says there are other ways to verify citizenship and that the state has to follow up and handle that process? Then the claim that people will just be casually locked out of the system starts looking a lot less like a serious warning and a lot more like political theater. And man, Washington loves political theater. They love it so much they'll ignore the obvious just to keep the performance going. That's why a bill like this drives them nuts. It's too easy to understand. It's too easy to explain. It fits into one sentence. Only citizens should vote, and there should be proof. That is not complicated messaging. You can't bury that under 10 layers of consultant-approved language. You can't hide it behind jargon. You can't spin it into something noble and abstract. The public hears it and immediately gets it.
I'm happy to report to my dear friend and colleague, Senator Durbin from Illinois, you're in luck. We've taken care of that. When you read the bill, what you'll discover is that we've made special accommodation for those who don't have documentation, for those who can't find their birth certificate, maybe their house burned down, maybe their dog ate it, whatever it is. When all else fails, if you don't have documentation establishing the information on your birth certificate or what would be in a passport or otherwise, the bill contains a provision requiring each state to allow an alternative mechanism by which someone can, by attestation, issue a sworn statement establishing the critical facts underlying their citizenship. It then puts the onus on the state to follow up on that and to determine the authenticity of it.
That's why the popularity of voter ID and citizenship verification matters so much here. These are not fringe positions. These are not weird online obsessions. These ideas poll extremely well because people instinctively understand that secure elections and accessible elections are not opposites. You can do both. In fact, you should do both. That's the grown-up answer. Make voting easy for eligible citizens and hard for ineligible participants. That is what a functioning country would do. Instead, we get this bizarre routine where common sense guardrails are treated like sinister oppression. And honestly, it's insulting. Not just politically insulting, intellectually insulting. Voters are expected to pretend they don't notice the double standard. They're expected to nod along while politicians act like showing ID is impossible, paperwork is oppressive, and citizenship verification is somehow beyond the capabilities of a modern nation. Meanwhile, everyday Americans are out here handling taxes, mortgages, insurance claims, school forms, medical records, travel documents, and everything else life throws at them, but proving citizenship one time for voting. Suddenly that's too much, please. And then there's the other trick in this debate, minimizing the problem entirely. Durbin tried to brush off non-citizen voting as basically irrelevant, throwing out tiny numbers as if that settles everything. But that misses the point in a huge way. First, people clearly dispute the scale. Second, the exact number is not even the only issue. The issue is whether the system should have a clear standard. If there's a vulnerability, even a small one, why leave it there on purpose? Why defend ambiguity? Why fight so hard against closing the gap? That's what makes this such a loser argument politically. Even people who think actual illegal voting is rare can still support safeguards. In fact, most probably do, because confidence matters, trust matters, legitimacy matters. Elections are one of those things where people need to believe the system is clean. The standard shouldn't be, well, maybe the problem isn't massive, so let's just leave it fuzzy. No, the standard should be, let's make it airtight so nobody has to keep relitigating this every cycle.
States have access to their own records. States have reciprocity with other states and are able to achieve verification of that. So we've taken care of that problem, and so I'm sure you'll be elated to hear that, and we look forward to having your affirmative vote when we vote on the Save America Act. We took great pains to go out of our way to make sure that no American would be left in the dark.
Well,
this will not cost them a dime, and no one will be excluded if they can't find their documentation.
This is such a scourge on American political scene that in the last 20 years, there have been 24 identified cases of non-Americans trying to vote. 24 people in 20 years. And the president said, we won't consider any other legislation until we consider this bill.
And here's where it gets even more awkward for the anti-ID crowd. Other countries do this. A lot of them, countries that are constantly praised as civilized, modern democratic models, somehow manage to require photo ID for voting without descending into chaos. Their voters are not curled up in despair because someone asked them to verify who they are. They function. Their elections continue. Democracy survives. Amazing how that works. So what are we really being asked to believe here? That Americans are uniquely incapable of meeting a standard that much of the rest of the world treats as normal? That requiring proof of citizenship is offensive here but routine elsewhere? That showing identification is both too burdensome for voting and completely fine for 100 lesser activities? It doesn't hold up. It collapses under its own contradictions. And maybe the most revealing piece of all is the way Democrats keep trying to frame this as a minority issue, because that argument has gotten really old, really fast. At some point, someone needs to say it plainly. Treating minority voters like they're incapable of getting ID is not compassionate. It's condescending. It's elitist. It's the kind of argument that sounds progressive in a faculty lounge and absolutely ridiculous in the real world. That street interview clip gets right to the core of it. You have these polished, confident activists and pundits insisting that voter ID is racist because Black Americans supposedly can't navigate basic administrative tasks, can't find the DMV, can't use the internet, can't get identification. And then you ask actual Black voters and the response is basically, what are you even talking about? That disconnect is brutal. It exposes the entire mindset. Too many political operatives don't actually speak with ordinary people anymore. They speak around them. They project onto them. They reduce them to talking points. And that's why these arguments keep backfiring, because the more Democrats insist that basic election security is somehow oppression, the more they reveal how little faith they seem to have in the very voters they claim to defend. They talk about minorities like helpless props in a campaign ad instead of capable adults. And people notice that. They notice the patronizing tone. They notice the assumptions. They notice how often protecting democracy starts to sound like, trust us, don't ask questions.
Opinion on voter ID laws?
Yeah, they're usually pretty racist and they're bad.
I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identifications.
Do you think that's harder for Black people to go online?
Well, I feel like they don't have the knowledge of how it works.
Do you know any Black adult who does not have ID?
No, I don't.
Is it a weird thing to even say that?
Yes, it is.
What is this, some type of trick candy cameras?
I know, right? That's the only thing I brought with me.
Those are legit IDs. I heard a lot also that Black people can't figure out how to get to the DMV.
Really?
What does that say to you?
I know it's that, on 25th Street.
Do you know where the DMV is around you?
It's on 125th Street and 3rd Avenue, I believe.
You know how to get there?
Yeah.
Would you have a problem getting there if you had to get there?
No.
Would you have a problem if when you go to vote, if they say, could we please just see your ID to make sure you are who you say you are? Do you have an issue with that?
No.
Would you have a problem if there was a rule where you had to show your ID in order to vote?
I don't think so, no.
Would you have an issue if there was a rule saying you got to show your ID before you vote?
Nah.
You cool with that?
Yeah.
Now, zoom out for a second, because this isn't only about one bill. It's about a Congress that seems allergic to doing simple, obvious things. That's what makes this debate so frustrating. Lawmakers will spend endless hours turning themselves into human fog machines over issues with broad public support, then act shocked when voters think the whole institution is broken. And honestly, can you blame them? This Congress has looked old, slow, theatrical, and weirdly detached from normal priorities. That's not even an insult anymore. It's a description. You've got some members who seem more committed to protecting talking points than solving problems. You've got leadership figures who've been around so long they talk like they're debating in a different century. And every time one of these common sense proposals comes up, we're reminded that the biggest bottleneck in American politics is not a lack of public will. It's a lack of courage, clarity, and competence inside the building. That's why term limits keep coming up in these conversations too, because people watch these hearings and think, how are these the sharpest voices we could find? How are these the people entrusted with managing the most powerful country in the world? It starts to feel like a retirement committee with security clearance. And the longer this goes on, the more obvious the disconnect becomes between what regular Americans want and what career politicians are willing to fight for. The wild thing is, supporting something like proof of citizenship to vote should not even be this dramatic. It should be one of those rare bipartisan layups. Secure the process, add accommodations for legitimate edge cases, make the rules clear, reassure the public, move on, done. Instead, it turns into another grand moral spectacle where the people opposing basic verification act like they're defending civilization itself. It's exhausting, and voters are tired of exhaustion politics. They're tired of every simple issue being dressed up like a constitutional apocalypse. They're tired of being told not to believe their own instincts. They're tired of politicians who hear a reasonable proposal and immediately sprint to the most hysterical interpretation possible. That trick used to work better than it does now. These days, more people are looking at the script and seeing exactly what it is. Because at the end of the day, this really is common sense. Citizenship should matter in citizen elections. Identification should matter when verifying identity. Confidence in elections should matter in a democracy. None of that is extreme. None of that is hateful. None of that is unreasonable. What's unreasonable is pretending those ideas are controversial. And that's why Durbin's performance lands so badly. It doesn't come across as persuasive. It comes across as panicked. It feels like the kind of argument you make when you know the public is against you, so all you have left is exaggeration. But exaggeration only gets you so far, especially when the opposing side can answer it with a sentence that makes more sense than your entire speech. That's the real lesson here. People are starving for clarity. They're starving for laws that match common sense. They're starving for politicians who can explain themselves without needing a smoke machine and a translator. The Save America Act taps into that hunger in a big way. Not because it's flashy, not because it's revolutionary, but because it feels obvious. And in modern politics, obvious has become strangely powerful. So yeah, this debate matters, not just because of what's in the bill, but because of what the reaction to it reveals. It reveals who trusts voters and who tries to manipulate them. It reveals who wants cleaner rules and who benefits from confusion. And it reveals just how disconnected some of these long-serving politicians have become from the country they claim to represent. At some point, Washington needs to decide whether it works for ordinary Americans or for its own permanent theater production, because the public is watching and they're a lot less impressed by the act than they used to be. Let me know what you think in the comments. Should proving citizenship to vote be considered basic common sense, or do you think the objections hold up? And while you're down there, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more, because this conversation is not going away anytime soon.